Reddit, what are your favorite folktales, myths and urban legends? Mine would be Näcken. It's an old Swedish myth. Näcken roughly translates to the naked one, and it's a demon/wood spirit that would take the form of an extremely beautiful young man and play the fiddle by streams or lakes. In some stories he is quite evil and lures children and young women and drown them. Sort of a soul collector for Satan. In other stories people would leave their fiddle on a rock by the waters where Näcken had been seen. Näcken would, if you were lucky, come up from the water and tune your fiddle, and by doing that, give you the power to play like no mortal man could. There is also a great amount of old tunes in Nordic folk music tradition called Näcken tunes, where you tune your fiddle in a special way. The legend says that these tunes were passed down from people who learned to play from Näcken. Loki and the Three Gifts. It's a Norse myth. So, Thor had a wife named Sif, and she had gorgeous bold hair that shone like gold, and was the envy of everyone. Once when Thor was away, Loki snuck into Sif's home and cut off all of her hair until she was bald. Thor was furious and swore revenge. He found Loki and told him that unless he found a way to replace Sif's hair, that Thor would break every bone in his body. Now of course there is no way to make hair grow back, so Loki went to see the Black Elves, master smiths, to see what they could do. He sweet-talked them into making a wig out of strands of gold, and when he left with 2 other gifts from the elves, a magic ship which folded up into your pocket for transport, and a spear that was bewitched to always find its target no matter how clumsily it was thrown. When Loki was on his way back to Asgard, he ran into a dwarf. This dwarf was the brother of Sindri, the best workman in all the world. Loki told him about the 3 gifts from the Black Elves, and the dwarf swore that whatever the elves had made, Sindri could make something better. Loki told him that he wagered his head that the Black Elves' gifts were better than anything Sindri could make. So Sindri made 3 gifts, and Brock and Loki presented them in front of the gods. First Loki gave the golden hair to Sif, and it was a fine substitute for her old hair. Then he gave the spear to Odin, and the ship to Frey. The 3 were very grateful and very impressed with the gifts. Sindri's brother Brock first gave to Odin a magic golden ring, which every night would produce an identical 8 golden rings. Odin put it on and exclaimed that he preferred it to the spear. Next, to Frey, he gave a golden boar, that could run on air or on water, more swiftly than any horse, and would never get tired. Frey was pleased, and preferred the boar to the ship. Finally, Sindri pulled out a great hammer, made of iron, Mjolnir. Mjolnir could hammer any metal, split any rock, shrink down small enough to fit in Thor's pocket, and when thrown, would always return to Thor's hand. All of the gods agreed that Brock had won the wager, and so he was entitled to Loki's head. Loki said that it was fine to take his head, but Brock could not have any of his neck. So since Brock couldn't decide where Loki's head ended and where his neck began, he couldn't take Loki's head. Loki laughed and taunted him, so Brock took a needle and thread and sewed Loki's mouth shut. And that is the story of Loki temporarily learning a lesson, and of the gods receiving some amazing gifts. When Hitler annexed Prague, he heard that there was a Jewish composer statue on top of the opera house by the river. There's a bunch of composers and one is missing today, FYI, so he told a Nazi to go on top of the opera house and push the composer off. When the Nazi asked which one, Hitler said, "I don't know, the one with the biggest nose." And the Nazi pushed the one with the biggest nose off the roof. It was Richard Wagner, Hitler's favorite composer, another anti-Semite. I heard it on a tour of Prague. Seriously doubt it's true, but I always thought it was funny. The Scorpion and the Frog, one of Aesop's fables. A scorpion and a frog meet on the bank of a stream, and the scorpion asks the frog to carry him across on its back. The frog asks, "How do I know you won't sting me?" The scorpion says, "Because if I do, I will die too." The frog is satisfied, and they set out, but in midstream, the scorpion stings the frog. The frog feels the onset of paralysis and starts to sink, knowing they both will drown. But has just enough time to gasp why? Replies the scorpion, "It is my nature." And that's it. It's morbid, but can really make you feel better when people do the same shitty things over and over again. It is their nature. My friend's babysitter had a cousin who was 16. The family had a general store which they ran together. It was in the middle of a street and there were windows that looked right into it. The cousin was having a very tough life. Babysitter didn't want to talk about that, and one day, the cousin took a noose, hung it around a pipe that ran across the shop, and hung himself. His white clothes were stained with blood from where the rope had dug into his neck, and he had an empty black rucksack on that was open. The whole family was shocked. They could not believe he had done it. The grandmother of the family lived in the apartment above the shop and was very ill. She always had to lie in bed next to the window so she could get fresh air. The day after the loss, the family decided that they must go and tell the grandmother what had happened. When they entered her room, she said immediately, "I know why you are here. You have come to tell me that my grandson has killed himself. I know this because after he had done it, I saw him. He walked out onto the street in a white t-shirt and tracksuits. He had looked up at this window, and he waved whilst smiling. A black car then pulled up next to him, which he climbed into and drove off. The whole family was terrified. They had no idea what to do or say. In the end, they had the funeral and nothing more was said about it." The grandmother was 80 and was in very bad condition, so whether this story is true, I know not. Nobody had entered her apartment, called her, sent her mail, nothing. I like the Penanggalan. From Wikipedia. The Penanggalan is usually a female midwife who has made a pact with the devil to gain supernatural powers. It is said that the midwife has broken a stipulation in the pact not to eat meat for 40 days. Having broken the pact, she has been forever cursed to become a blood-sucking vampire/demon. The midwife keeps a vat of vinegar in her house. After detaching her head and flying around in the night looking for blood, the Penanggalan will come home and immerse her entrails in the vat of vinegar in order to shrink them for easy entry back into her body. The Penanggalan's victims are traditionally pregnant women and young children. Like a banshee who appears at a birth rather than a death, the Penanggalan perches on the roofs of houses where women are in labor, screeching when the child is born. The Penanggalan will insert a long invisible tongue into the house to lap up the blood of the new mother. Those whose blood the Penanggalan feeds upon contract a wasting disease that is almost inescapably fatal. Furthermore, even if the Penanggalan is not successful in her attempt to feed, anyone who is brushed by the dripping entrails will suffer painful open sores that won't heal without a Bomo's help. I love Loki. I once wrote a paper about him and, as far as I know, this is the only story in which Loki isn't a total a-hole. So there's a farmer playing a game with a giant. The farmer had been beating the giant each round, so for the next round he cockily bet his son. The giant accepted the wager and turns right around and beat the farmer at the game. He stood up and said, "I'll be back tomorrow to claim my prize." Tearily, the farmer went to his family and told them about the wager. They proceeded to all weep and beseech the gods. Odin descended from the heavens and asked them what the trouble was. They explained, and the god rubbed his chin and thought. He came up with the idea to turn the boy into a grain of wheat and hit him in the wheat field the farmer worked. The next day, the giant came by with a scythe. When the family claimed they had no idea where the son was, he started whacking down all the wheat in the field. He eventually found the stalk where the boy was hiding, but before he could do anything, Odin snatched the grain away and turned him back into his true form. "All right," the giant said, "I'll come back tomorrow." So the family prayed again, and this time Hoenir came to greet them. They explained once again, and Hoenir came up with the idea to turn the boy into a piece of down. He hid the down in the breast of a swan that lived in a nearby lake. So the next day the giant came. When the family said they didn't know where the son was, he went straight to the lake and seized the swan by the neck. Hoenir swiftly summoned up a breeze to blow the piece of down back to the family, where he was turned back into a boy. "All right," the giant said, "I'll be back tomorrow." More desperate than ever, the family prayed with fervor. This time Loki was there to hear their troubles. Loki turned the boy into a fish egg and hid him in a fish that was in the ocean. When the giant came the next day, he didn't even speak to the family and went straight to the coast with a fishing rod. On his first cast he caught the correct fish. He cut open its belly and held the piece of roe in his hand. Loki intervened, grabbing the roe and turning it back into a boy. "Run back home, and run through the shack on the beach. Close the door behind you." The boy followed the instructions, running through and closing the door. The giant, enraged, made pursuit. However, earlier Loki had set a trap in the shack and closing the door set it. So when the giant tried to pass through, he was knocked flat on the ground. Loki then came up to the giant and cut off his leg. More moments later, though, the leg reconnected itself back to its owner with nary a scratch to show there was ever a wound. So, Loki cut the leg once more and put a piece of iron over the cut to prevent such magic. Loki then beat the giant to death with his own leg. Since I saw some old Nordic ones here, I'll add one. When the gods decided to chain up Fenrir, the big-ass wolf Loki spawned. The wolf easily ripped any chain they could find. Finally the dwarves created a chain made out of the roots of mountains, the roaring of cats, the breath of fish, tendon of bears, the beards of women and the spit of birds. And that's why you can't find those things in the world today. There was this one road in California. Before interstates it was used, but recently it wasn't used. As all things that aren't used, stories began. That during a full moon the road changed. It went on forever, and if you drove on it you would be lost. Forever. Eventually the mayor of a nearby town got lost and an investigation is launched. Apparently a bridge that once existed over a large drop, and during full moons the light would make the road line up so you couldn't see the missing bridge. Over 27 cars were found. The legend of the ghost of La Llorona, the weeping woman. It's a New Mexican folktale. There once was a beautiful woman named Maria, who was more beautiful than all the other women in her village, and always thought that there was never a man good enough to suit her. She had been wooed by almost all the men in her village, and most men that came to the village traveling, but none were ever good enough. One day, a handsome, wealthy man came to the village while traveling and fell in love with Maria, and she had finally accepted this man as good enough to go out with, and they fell deeply in love. They had 3 children and lived in the city of Tos by the river. After 10 years passed, the man left Maria, abandoning their family, and leaving them very poor. Every day, Maria looked at her children, and reminded herself of her only love, and what he had brought upon her. She had lost her beauty with age and could probably never marry again, with her standards set so high. In a fit of rage, she took her children out to the river, grabbing their arms so hard that her fingernails dug into their skin and made them bleed, and threw them in. After doing this, she realized she had just murdered the only family and chance of happiness she had left, and chased after them. After a couple minutes of running down the river, she hit her head on a rock and died. They say in Tos, at night, you can still hear her screaming for her lost children near the river, but if her spirit see a child walking near the river after dark, she becomes enraged and throws them into the river. The purpose of the story is to try to keep the children from going out after dark. Melon heads. Growing up on the east side of Cleveland, Ohio, I lived near a small country town called Kirtland. Total urban legend that every teenage in the area knew. I can't remember one person who didn't have a friend or older brother that wasn't attacked by them while stuck on the side of the road. The story was that they were a bunch of mentally handicapped orphans that had bulbous disfigured heads. They were adopted by a local doctor, and when he died they began to protect their home by any means necessary. I am convinced that the X-Files episode about the inbred family was based on this story. I live in Texas now, and whenever I bring friends back to the area on trips, I'll take them out to Kirtland for a drive to see some of the parks and old farmhouses. If it gets dark, I tell them all about the melon heads. It's easy to just pick a random farmhouse and start spinning an insane story about what actually happened there. Saint Polycarp. This was at the time that Christians were being tossed to the lions in the Colosseum. The Romans came to Polycarp and said, if you keep teaching that Jesus is Lord, we are going to burn you at the stake. Polycarp said, go ahead, for God has promised me that the flames will not harm my body. So the Romans burnt him at the stake. But just as God had said, the flames did not harm Polycarp's body. That's when the Romans decided that they didn't like a wise ass. So they put out the fire and stabbed him. Scandinavian folklore is always interesting, especially when portrayed in music. My favorite tale would have to be Ashland and the Hungry Troll. It is about a young man who enters the deep forest to gather wood for his father's oven. With him he carries bread and a piece of cheese. After a while, a huge troll shows up and claims to be the ruler of the forest, thus making Ashland an intruder. Ashland, brave as he is, shows the troll his piece of cheese, claiming it is solid rock. As Ashland squeezes it, the troll is under the impression that the boy is extremely strong. Amazed, the troll asks the boy how much he can eat. Herm, a boy with powers like yourself must eat quite a lot. How about an oatmeal dinner, commonly known as havregrøt in Norway, at my cave? Let's see who's the quickest eater. Ashland has always had a hard time saying no to competitions like these. He climbs up on top of the large troll and together they walk through the woods, until they reach the troll cave. The troll warms up 2 large portions of oatmeal, and so the eating competition begins. Of course, Ashland always has a way of tricking trolls in these kinds of situations. And this tale is no different. After a while, he grabs his large hunting knife, gives it a quick glance, and sticks it into his stomach. Of course, the trick Ashland used was to keep his backpack under his sweater, making it look like he cut open his stomach. But instead, he just acted like he was eating normally, and stuffed his backpack full of oatmeal. The troll is astonished. What is this sorcery? The troll is starting to get scared. What kind of creature did he bring home? Ashland explains that cutting a hole in one's stomach allows one to eat a lot more. The troll cannot believe his eyes. Ashlyn tells the troll to try it out. Just do as I just did. Take a nice grip, and force it in there. The troll hesitates. Are you sure it won't hurt? He asks. Of course not, does it look like I'm crying? Ashlyn's replies, rather arrogant. The troll cannot let himself lose to a young boy. He takes a good grip, and cuts himself up. The story of Jesus in the Bible has a big gap in his life, from age 13 to 30, where there is no information on him. These are called the missing years. Some scholars believe he spent those years in India, studying Buddhism and Hinduism. I recently saw a documentary called Jesus in India, made by a theologian of Texas fundamentalist background, who became intrigued by the idea of Jesus in India, so he went there and started asking around. It seems that it's pretty much accepted fact that Jesus lived in Kashmir for several years, and studied at several temples and monasteries. He's known in India as Saint Isa, and the filmmaker found lots of people who seem to know quite a bit about him, from their own perspectives as Buddhists and Hindus. They take it as fact that he lived there. Some even say that he survived the crucifixion and returned to Kashmir, and there is a tomb where he's supposed to be buried. I liked the intellectual honesty of the documentary. The author tried, but failed, to find written documentation on him, and presents evidence on both sides of the question, especially on how he could have survived crucifixion. There are interviews with Muslim, Buddhist and Hindu scholars, and the only closed minds were those of a Catholic scholar who absolutely denied that he went to India, and a group of Muslims outside his alleged tomb, and that's a scary scene. In the Northeast US, there's a story about woods people or man-o'-woods. When you're driving along a road in the woods and catch a glimpse of what looks like a person in the corner of your eye, but when you look directly at it it's gone, they say you might have encountered a man-o'-woods. They are masters of camouflage and can sense when someone looks at them. They come to a halt so you can't sense any movement. It's speculated that they wear bark, mud, moss, and grasses to blend in. They're supposedly human, but extremely simple-minded, barely verbal. They're very small in stature and avoid contact with civilization mostly. Nobody knows where they live or congregate, but they usually move on if there's too much activity around. They're also peaceful. Around some farmlands, they will do very simple chores at night or off in the distance. They may sweep a barn floor or stack some wood, but anything more complex is beyond them. They do it in exchange for not bothering them as they sleep in the barn for a night or for some bread and vegetables left out for them to find. They've never been known to steal or kill animals or livestock. So, I had a football coach back in high school who was also one of my teachers for a semester. He told us one story that freaked us all out pretty bad. He had a coaching job at a small college in Montana when he was a lot younger and newly married. He said that after practice one evening, he was making his long commute home, and the route ran alongside just fields and fields of hay, grain, whatever. Since it was late summer/early fall, it wasn't even approaching dark yet. His car was an old beat-up truck with just a bench seat. Anyway, he's driving along when he sees a hitchhiker on the shoulder. This being back in the day and in small-town Montana, my teacher pulled over to let the guy in without a second thought. The man was described as wearing a really old, outdated style of suit. Not quite a zoot suit, but styled in a similar, baggy way. He also had a big, stylish hat. This guy looked like he was out of the 40s, and sort of like a pimp. My teacher thought it was weird that he was so overdressed, it being super hot out. But maybe that was the only clothing he had. So the guy gets in next to my teacher without a word. Teacher asks him where he needs to go, and the guy just points forward. Teacher drives on. Later, my teacher tried talking to the guy, just trying to make simple conversation, but the guy wouldn't speak or even acknowledge him. He just pulled his hat down like he was sleeping. Out of nowhere, the guy just tips up his hat, looks out the window, and says, "Stop the car, now." My teacher pulls over and lets him out, not wanting to offend a possibly crazy man. The guy stands on the side of the road for a second, and then at a dead sprint, just runs off into the field beside the road, until my teacher couldn't see him anymore. Granted, the crop was fairly tall. He waits there for a while, thinking maybe the guy had the runs or something and didn't want to shit next to the road. After a long enough wait, my teacher gets back in the truck and starts to accelerate back onto the road. The thing about really old trucks is that they don't accelerate very fast. As my teacher got back onto the road, he looked in his rearview mirror to check for a safe merge. But there wasn't a car in sight. What there was the hitchhiker, on all fours like an animal, running, crawling, after the truck at an inhuman speed. Meanwhile, my teacher is beginning to fishtail as he attempts to go faster. The whole time his eyes glued on the mirror, watching the man chase after his car. Eventually, he was able to get up to speed and lost sight of the guy in his mirror. When he was able to stop at a gas station to use a payphone, he called his wife at home to tell her the story, and to lock up the house. She thinks he's just messing with her, and he had been talking to her coworker about the hitchhiker. When he asks why she would think that, apparently at her office in the town she worked in, one of her coworkers told her a story of the exact same thing happening to them. And it is a well-known urban legend in that town. She thought it was just folks playing with the new girl at work, who had to drive home alone at night. Anyways, my teacher assured her that he was not lying, and she evidently believes him and can vouch for her side of the story, because she showed up to one of our fundraisers and I asked her about it. So yeah, now I just avoid lonely roads in Montana. I live in northern Australia and everyone growing up in my town knows of the legend of the Poinsiana Woman. A quick Google search will elaborate into the many variations to the story, but the one I grew up to know is that of a woman who was assaulted by Japanese fishermen who hanged herself from a poinsiana tree when she had discovered she was pregnant. She is said to appear as a beautiful woman to entice men, with long dark hair dressed in a white gown, and is said to be situated at our Army Reserve. When I was around 12, and my younger brother 10, he had been in his room and I was in the lounge room on the computer. He had come barreling out from his room screaming, "Can you hear that? Can you hear that?" before dragging me over to the window. There was a faint feminine moan/hum, we could hear it moving from the window we stood at, to the one across the room and back in a clockwise direction. The wind had picked up with the noise despite how still the night had been. The sound became so loud that we were on the floor covering our ears crying. When I brought it up recently, my brother agrees it was almost as if the sound had been in our heads. This went on for about 10 minutes before abruptly stopping. No wind, nothing. We found out the next day that our older siblings had been at the Army Reserve that night before they got home, had climbed the concrete pillars to the locked gun turret and had been taunting the Poinsiana Woman before they left when they heard footsteps, assuming it was security. What creeps me out most is that not long after this happened, I realized that we had a Poinsiana tree outside of that window. As always, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, show your support. Leave your thoughts and opinions down below.